been out building a company for over 18 years now. There's a lot of things that you see in that time, and you see a lot of things go wrong. And you see mistakes happening, you see bad things happening in an organization, there's friction or retention, whatever. And I can remember some of those situations in FreeAgent. And so these days, when something goes wrong, my first reaction is, it's going to be fine. And it's not that big of a deal. We'll figure it out. Let's just work out what we have to do here. And that is one of the most powerful things you can do. I always say, my number one rule of leadership, don't make it worse. That is your first priority in leadership.
So today I'm delighted to be joined by Roan Lavery. Roan talks today about being punched in the face, how his background in martial arts and combat martial arts specifically has kind of prepared him to be a CEO at the kind of highest level. Roan shares some fantastic advice from his background in combat martial arts, how to prepare yourself for a situation and how being the CEO and being involved in a challenging or difficult situation with your business can actually sometimes make it worse. And Roan shares some great advice for dealing with difficult situations, like being punched in the face, but equally what the business equivalent of that is and how you prepare yourself and how you act in those situations really maketh the CEO. He also shares some great advice about talking on stage, about being a modern CEO and his journey from being a founder to being a chief product officer to being a CEO to his business ultimately being bought by NatWest Bank here in the UK. So without further ado, let's listen to the episode with Roan. I'm very pleased to welcome Roan to the show. How are you today, Roan?
I'm great, Joe. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So I've got this very strong memory. You told me of a story once about being punched in the face. Because you've got a background. Am I right thinking it's background in martial arts? Have you got some sort of background in that?
Used to, so many years ago, it was a while ago now. It's harder to do when you've got such a busy business and a big family. But I did study quite a few different martial arts for quite a number of years, competed at a relatively high level. So yeah, I did do quite a lot of different martial arts.
Yeah. And you told me the story about being punched in the face. Do you want to expand on that and sort of retell that story for our listeners? What it's like to be punched in the face and sort of why you're not so worried about it anymore?
Yeah, it does sound a little bit weird, and I think I probably have to caveat this story in a couple of ways. But essentially, what we were talking about, I started off in some martial arts, more traditional martial arts, things like kung fu, and then and this was in the mid-90s, and then over time I sort of transitioned into more of the combat sports martial arts, and those things like Muay Thai, Thai boxing, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And in combat sport martial arts, there's much more of a focus on sparring, on fighting, where you're putting yourself into these high pressure situations and quite often getting punched in the face. Now, nobody likes getting punched in the face, right? Put it out there, and I think there's this quite visceral reaction that people have to violence, quite rightly. We shouldn't minimize or undermine that. However, when you're doing a combat sport and I was doing it 4 or 5 times a week, literally in situations where I was going in with people who were much bigger than me, much scarier than me, who were, hitting me and punching me in the face on a regular basis. And after a while, you stop to worry about that as much. You still don't like it. Nobody enjoys it. But that visceral reaction that you get, where that adrenaline dump and it puts you into this fight or flight or freeze mode, that's typically what happens when people are put into these very stressful situations. You learn to manage that and you learn to cope with it. And so, although you never enjoy it, you'll be able to put yourself like, okay, I've been hit, that's fine. I've been here lots of times before. I'm then able to work out what the appropriate thing I need to do in that situation is. So it's just about, that exposure to high pressure and stressful situations allows you to manage that fear, manage that discomfort, and then think about what the most appropriate reaction is. And so, yeah, that's sort of really what that allowed me to do. And it's people often talk about this inner calm and confidence that you get from martial arts, and that's where it comes from. Is that being like, okay, if I was to get mugged, I clearly I don't want that to happen. But I'm also in a situation where I know I'm not going to freeze up because I know that I've been in stressful situations before, and I can handle myself. So yeah, it was quite a it was quite a transformative thing for me when I went through that period in my life, and it was very, very beneficial.
And so, how does that translate into the way you are in the business environment now? What have you sort of taken from that into the world that you're in now?
I mean, I think it is that confidence and that belief you can do things. The other thing that I went on after I sort of did martial arts. I did a lot of sort of endurance sports. So I did sort of marathon running. Aside, I did like
Mm,
an Iron Man. And I remember when I sort of started down that route, um, when you if you've never like sort of like trained for marathon before, it can seem like impossible. Like for most people who've never done like a lot of running, the thought of like running for 26 miles just seems like utterly impossible.
mm.
But then you do a little bit and you build up your training week on week, and then you do like a 7 mile run, an 8 mile run, 9 mile run, blah, blah. And after a while, you start to say, oh, do you know what? I can actually see how this is possible. The thing which previously seemed unattainable, it seemed like inconceivable, starts to come into focus as something that you can do. And so that is another subject. And I remember sort of thinking, oh, like, how many other areas of my life are there things that seem impossible, but actually I just need to work my way towards them in a gradual, progressive, steady fashion, and that will come into focus as something that I can achieve. And so it is that, and that ultimately, doing the martial arts, doing the endurance training, it builds that sense of confidence that, do you know what? I may not know how to do something today, but I'm confident in my ability to learn it if I just work hard and focus on it. And so that's absolutely something that translated into lots of other parts of my life, personal and professional, for sure, and as a leader as a business.
So, can you think of any examples, certainly within the professional world you're in now, of where you've sort of fallen back on those skills or that mentality or that way of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, so me transitioning into the role of CEO was probably the biggest recent one. So I started off doing the design and the front end, and my background was a designer. As the company grew, I sort of transitioned into more of a product role and as more of a product leader, and I was the CPO for a long time at FreeAgent. And then when Ed, who was the previous CEO, stepped down in 2021, that's when I moved into that role. And there was obviously bits of the business that I was very comfortable with and very familiar with, obviously predominantly more on the product side of the organization. But there was also other parts of the business that I was much less familiar with. I mean, I sat on the exec team and I was the founder, so it wasn't like I had no exposure. But they were definitely not in my comfort zone, finance, sales, things like that. And so I knew that was like, okay, there's a lot of things here that I don't know about. But then I just had to have sort of the conversation with myself. It's like, well, okay, you can probably learn them. Other people have learned this stuff. You can probably learn it too. And you've got the support of a great team who are going to help you and support you through this. You don't have to do it on your own as well. And that was it. I guess that was the sort of conversation I had when I was going into that role.
I love that. And it sounds like it does sound like that marathon training, right? It sort of feels quite that leap from CPO to CEO is a big one. And I don't think a lot of people realize what a leap it is from another C-suite role into the CEO.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that that marathon training kind of held you in good stead because you kind of knew how to, okay, this is big and this is difficult, but if I break this up, I can do this bit by bit and eventually I'll get there.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was also there was a little bit of sort of like putting your money where your mouth is associated. Like as a sort of co-founder, me and my other two co-founders, we'd constantly sort of like argue and debate about things in the business,
Mm.
and everybody's got opinions, right? Everybody's got, oh, we should do things this way, do things this way. And a little bit of it was like me saying, so, listen, there's been things which I've said about the company that I wish we were doing it in this way, or I don't like this and I think we should be doing it in this way. And this was really my opportunity to say, okay, if you really believe that stuff, then do it. Don't just complain about it. Actually go and do it and try and put the change. And at the same time, try and learn about all these other aspects of the business that maybe you didn't have much exposure to. And so I think just having that confidence in my own ability to learn, I think is a really important thing.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
it's come from some of that stuff we talked about. Yeah.
Well, it's always that ridiculousness if you hear people saying, "Oh, you can't teach an old dog new tricks" and things like that. I mean, it sounds to me like your learning is it a constant journey for you? You're always learning, you're always adapting, you're always changing.
Yeah,
Talk to me about that.
absolutely. I mean, I think as an individual, you're growing older, you're getting like more experiences. I think for me,
Yeah.
it's like I wasn't ever bored of the stuff I was doing before. So it wasn't like I was like, oh, I'm really like I love product, I love that sort of like side that I still
Mm.
do. We've talked about that. But I think the interesting thing about being a CEO is that, ultimately you have all the pieces of the machine at your disposal. You can really think about, I love strategy. Strategy is like probably one of my biggest passions. And you can do a lot with product strategy, but when you really think about how product strategy, sales strategy, go to market, all of these things fit together, it's just a much bigger opportunity that you have. And that was a really interesting thing for me, a really interesting challenge. But I knew I was going to have to learn about some of these other parts of the business that I was less comfortable with. So it was really with this end goal in sight, which is just a holistic view of the business, the market, our opportunities, how we can tune all of those things, and then where I was going to have to like fill in the gaps that I had. And so yeah, I mean, I think that if you're not learning at any age, it's just like you're doing yourself a disservice and probably those people around you as well.
Yeah, I love that. Can you talk more about that and that kind of ability, that shift you had to make from completing one part of the strategy to sort of, I suppose, orchestrating the whole strategy? How was that? Talk us through that, and what did you kind of learn from doing that exercise?
I think one of the big realizations and shifts that I've done is that I don't actually have to do all of the detailed strategies. And really a big part of my role has been setting enough direction so that the great teams that I have are then able to do that stuff as well. And that is a really big shift for me. And it's this gradual shift that you have through your career of I'm literally hands on making this stuff, coding it, in Figma, wherever it is, to, you're leading a team of people, to now you're leading, groups of departments and leaders who are the ones that are actually creating these strategies. So you need to give enough direction at the highest level about, this is really where I think we need to be heading as a business. This is what I see as some of the great opportunities, and give people enough of a steer, but don't micromanage them in that. Don't do all the work for them, because if you can then take a step back and see them come up with brilliant product strategies or brilliant sales strategies, and then how they all work together, that's actually one of the most satisfying shifts that I've gone on, is being able to take satisfaction not from me doing work, but from seeing other people do amazing work that may even be better than the work that I could have done, but that I've sort of like created the culture and the environment for that. And that's a really big mind shift. It sounds quite like a subtle thing, but it's a massive mind shift, especially for me anyway. I found that hard as somebody who's like, love getting into it. But it can be very rewarding. It can be incredibly rewarding.
And so it's wonderful to hear you on the other side of that. And I work with loads of founders kind of on that journey, but it's always the question of like, well, how do you do it right? How do you make that shift from being detail, practically involved in doing a lot of the work to that ability to manage it? What did you do kind of practically to make that shift? Was there any sort of advice you've got for others who are on that journey? How did you do it?
Yeah, and I think this doesn't just apply to founders and CEOs. I think this applies to anybody that's becoming more senior in their career and is moving more into those management leadership roles and away from being an IC or something. So I think this is a general philosophy and a general approach. So the number one thing, what you shouldn't do is just like say, right, that's me. I'm a leader now. You guys like crack on, reporting to me until we've done. That to me isn't good leadership. And what you quite often find is that people can flounder. Some people will do great in that situation, but that's not good leadership. That's just like letting people to sort of like try and fumble about themselves. So what I think you have to do is there's a gradual process of essentially giving people more ownership, giving people more autonomy, and at the same time having an appropriate level of direction and support until you see them sort of like step up, and then you like pull away. And I think that's the key thing, is like if you can see somebody who's excelling in their role and who's really delivering, that they're coming up with great ideas, great strategy, that's your sign, back off. Then you can back and let them sort of
Mhm.
like hit their stride and let them really go for it. And you usually see that spark in them at the time, because now they feel they've got the breathing room and the space to have that. What you don't want to do is like crush that sort of like energy and enthusiasm at that point. But if you see somebody and they're still struggling to get it right, don't let them flounder. Don't be like, well, it's your job now. You're supposed to come up with this strategy. Go in there and help them and support them. And what they probably need, there may be like a few different reasons for that. One, it may be a capability like issue, and that's one thing that you got to think about, who manage. more often than not, they just don't have all the context that they need to make the right decisions or to do the right things. So you've got to over communicate on, this is where we are as a business, this is what's going well, these are the opportunities and threats, this is what the market's doing, and just really over communicate that stuff to your teams. And that is one of your key roles as a leader. And then what you hope to find is that they then rise to that challenge, and they're like, going, okay, well, maybe we want to do this, and we come and try this, and we try this, and then you can start sort of gradually backing off. So it's a gradual process. And the way I often talk about this with individual teams is it's not always a linear, like one-way process either. There may be times when you have to go back and be more supportive and more hands-on. Like maybe some key people leave in your organization and they take a lot of domain knowledge with them. Or maybe you're doing a big pivot as a company, or maybe there's some big market change that's just happened and disrupted everything. And all of a sudden that environment that you thought was quite stable, maybe that's changed. And that may mean you have to go in there and give a little bit more help, and then everybody gets back on their feet again, and things sort of stabilize, and you can back off again. So it's this constant sort of like feeling the pulse of your organization and understanding how confident are everybody that they know what we're doing, know what we're trying to achieve. And if they are, then that's good. Your work here is done. Otherwise, you may have to be a bit more supportive.
No, I really love that ability to kind of lean forward and lean back, and just to adapt your style with different individuals and different times within the business as well. That's a really nice way to think about
Yeah.
it. Oh, wonderful. I'd like to loop back to the adrenaline spikes that we talked about at the start as well. So the kind of what you learned from dealing with those situations. Fast forwarding to now, as you in the role of the CEO, what sorts of situations do you think that where previously you maybe would have had an adrenaline spike you're not having
Yeah.
now? What kinds of situations do you find yourself feeling under control in those sorts of situations that maybe a first-time CEO or somebody less experienced might struggle in to a certain extent?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think, I've been building a company for over 18 years now. There's a lot of things that you see in that time, and you see a lot of things go wrong. And you see mistakes happening, you see bad things happening in an organization. Either you're not hitting the targets that you want to, or there's people issues and people are not getting on your company, wherever it is, right? There's friction or retention, or whatever. And I think that one of the real important things is like, it's very rare that any of these things will mean the end of your company. Everybody talks about that's it, we're fucked moment. So you have a few of those in your career, right? Where you kind of think, oh my God, like that's it. And I can remember some of those situations in FreeAgent, but they're very, very few and far between. And so these days, when something goes wrong, my first reaction is, it's going to be fine. Okay, it's probably going to be fine. And one of the most powerful things that you can do as a leader is to say that to people. And so generally what happens is, if I've been pulled into a situation, usually it means it's because something's gone wrong, right? Because if everything's going fine, then frankly, I'm just an annoyance, I'm not needed. So if there's situations, then people are like really worried about something, or they need to make a decision, or they want my input. Generally, it can be, it's because something bad has happened. And as a result of that, everybody is worried about it. So everybody is stressed out about that because they don't want to do the wrong thing, or they don't want to get in trouble. And then even just having the CEO there raises the stakes in that situation. So even just my presence of being there makes that already probably quite a tense situation even more stressful. And so my first role in that is to calm it down, and is to like de-escalate that situation and make everybody aware, okay, I'm here to help, and it's not that big of a deal. We'll figure it out. No one's getting in trouble here. Let's just like work out what we have to do here. And that is one of the most powerful things you can do. I always say, like, my number one rule of leadership: don't make it worse. That is your first priority in leadership, because you see so many leaders who are brought into difficult situations and they just make them worse. And they make them worse by taking an already stressful situation and just heaping more pressure on that. So your first priority: don't make it worse. Calm it down. Everybody can just like take a breather. This is like, we're just building some software here. It's not like nobody's on the operating table. It's going to be fine. We'll figure out what it is, and then we'll take the best thing forward. And you can visibly see the relief on people when you do that. And then everybody is like, okay, Now we can figure out what the right thing to do is. Not everybody's got their backs up, they're being super defensive. And that is a very important skill to master as a leader. Composure and emotional awareness.
And you're right. It sounds like it's back to that adrenaline spike, isn't it? Because you can't fight, you can't breathe, you can't do. There's only those reactions in there. You do have to slow it down and use your reasoning brain to solve the problem, not your animal brain. That ability to just suddenly decide to do. It's a very different set of thinking and approach you need to bring to it, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's just taking that moment and letting sort of like calm and reason. And the more like, listen, I get emotional about stuff. Of course you do in the moment. But especially, I think if you then have the opportunity to reflect and you can go back, or if you're being brought into a situation which there's already a little bit of friction or tension, you're actively going in with, okay, what I need to do here is just bring that sort of like sense of calm to everybody.
Yeah. And I loved your point there as well about the CEO being involved, right? The very fact you're in the room escalates the seriousness of the situation to a certain extent, which can make it almost worse for the team trying to deal with that in that moment as well.
It does, yeah. I mean, and I think other sort of that's just it's true for other sort of like senior leaders in the organization as well. And so you have a real responsibility in that situation to sort of like role model what you want people in your organization to be. Are you somebody that's going to sort of point the finger and blame people or escalate situations, or are you going to be there in a supportive environment where you're saying, like, listen, okay, our job here is to find a solution to this, whatever this issue is. It's not to sort of like point the finger or anything like that. So it's quite an important skill.
And I think it's really important to think about that as well, because it's when the teams or even the leader's reaction to the problem becomes more of a problem than the original problem itself, right? It creates more challenges when you go in and you blame and you react and you go into those situations. Like you say, that doesn't make it any better. It just escalates everything and makes the whole thing much, much, much worse.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I said. Like, your job is don't make it worse. And if you do make it worse, you're setting that as an example. And so other people will follow your example and they'll take your lead when they're talking to other people, perhaps lower down in the organization as well. So, yeah.
Let's talk about how you do that then. Because one of the things I think we've spoken on the same stage about at least 3 times. I've seen you speak at the Barbican in London. I've seen you speak on some really big stages. And what I was always impressed with is that you were calm, right? You sort of projected that, which again, if you're on stage and you are nervous, that's the worst possible thing for the audience. But you projected that calm out there. How do you do that then? So you can go into a situation and just go, everything's fine. Let's be calm. What do you sort of do in your head? How do you sort of work on that? What kind of some tips, or what was your process for doing that you could share to help other people when they're in that moment kind of get that level of control that you are great at?
There's maybe elements of some of the things that we've talked about over the years. I think specifically when you're in a high pressure, maybe like you're doing like a talk at a conference or something like that. I prepare a lot. And that's the thing. It's funny when you talk to these really good professional speakers. People that sort of like, do it all the time. You think, oh my God, they're so amazing. And you sort of like, oh, what's your secrets? Anyway, I practice. I practice and I prepare. And, some of those talks I would have spent weeks preparing for. So when I go on stage, I'm very, very comfortable in what I'm delivering. I'm still nervous, but I'm very, very comfortable in what I'm delivering. And so I'm not, the worst thing is when you're like, and you start to stumble over things and people pick up on that tension as you were saying. And so it's just about preparation. And after a while, like nowadays, I don't have to prepare nearly as much as I used to because I just feel a lot more confident in talking out of the cuff. But it wasn't always like that. The first few times I did these things, I really, really had to prepare for weeks and weeks. Manage to pull it off and bluff your way through it, and you do that enough times. Again, you put yourself in those situations enough times, and you will just start to feel more confident.
And it's interesting you say that you still get nervous when you do these things, right? You've been in physical confrontations with people much bigger than you. You've been on huge stages in the work. You still get nervous when you're doing it. It's not about fighting the nerves, is it? What is it? What do you how do you get into that mindset when you're feeling nervous like that? What's sort of going through your head?
I mean, there's an enjoyable aspect to this. I mean, if you're not enjoying, like, the reason that you step into a ring or something that, or do it, it's a very stressful situation. But people do it because ultimately they enjoy some aspect of it. And I think there are things in life, uncomfortable things in life, that are rewarding because of the uncomfortableness. And that's partly what it is. It's like, I know if I do this thing, I'm going to have to work hard in the lead up to it. So I'm going to have to prepare for it. And that itself is going to be like a beneficial thing. I'll be stressed, in the lead up to it and immediately beforehand. I'll probably actually start enjoying it while I'm doing it. And then afterwards, I'll feel this great sense of relief. And I'll also feel a lot of pride that, I did this kind of thing. And so there's those sort of like journeys that you kind of go on and around these sort of like stressful events where you know that, right? And so you go, and that's why you do it. And you also, I think, with some of the things that we do in terms of the talks and things like that, you also know that hopefully you're helping other people, right? So you're doing something that's going to give a bit back and help other people who maybe sort of like been in sort of similar situations. But yeah, I mean, ultimately you've got to find some enjoyment and some pleasure in this. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And so, what kinds of situations make you nervous these days? What ones do you sort of have that feeling in? Where are you feeling that?
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I still do quite a bit of public speaking. Um, I guess it's more around topics that I'm less comfortable with. There's some things about sort of like leadership and speaking about businesses and product that I've been doing it for quite a long time now, so I feel pretty comfortable. Occasionally, I get put into sort of events and panels and things like that where maybe the subject matter isn't exactly like the things which I'm most comfortable with, and that's when I have to then sort of say, okay, I need to do more prep for this thing. So it may be about, I don't know, talking about government policy or things which I sort of get involved with a little bit now, where I'm kind of like, okay, I'm going to have to do a lot more work around this.
What about in the business side of sort of running FreeAgent then? Is there anything in that world, like, directors, investors, stakeholders? Is there anything in that world that kind of, still is a bit of a challenge to you or something that isn't, that brings up the same feelings we've talked about?
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, I talked about when I moved into the CEO role, there was definitely areas of the business that I was less comfortable with. Another thing as well is that we're owned by NatWest Group, so we're part of that as an organisation, as a subsidiary of NatWest. And I sit on the leadership team of the business banking area of the bank. And that involves working with a whole different other sort of like set of stakeholder as well. And again, that's something which is quite different to me going into a completely different industry. It's not a software industry, it's a bank and it's such a large organization as well. And so that was something which was like a big learning curve for me, and something that was like something where in the early days I was definitely more nervous about that. And there was a lot I had to learn there and still do.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Right. One final question. You talked about earlier on some of the moments you faced sort of in the life of FreeAgent, those kind of, I can't just describe them exactly, like, holy fuck, this is
Yeah,
it. Sort of those
yeah,
those really scary incidents that you feel like, oh. Can you talk us through any of those? What sort of situation, what sort of in the journey of FreeAgent, where have been some of the biggest bumps in the road or biggest challenges you faced?
yeah. I think there was one which was. I think most of them probably occurred quite early on in the life when the business is in
Yeah.
like more of a sort of precarious state. I remember there was sort of like one um, probably 2 years into the organization. So we were all sort of still working at the time. We weren't working on the business full time. This was about 2009. And so other two co-founders, Ed and Ollie, they were both doing contracting. I was doing freelancing, but I also still had a job. I was working at a sort of web agency in Edinburgh. And the product had been out in the market for like a year and a half at this point. We had like maybe like I don't know, like a couple hundred customers, paying customers, which was good, and there was a little bit of money coming in, but it wasn't enough to sort of pay us full-time salaries or anything like that. And we all had very young kids. So my eldest was born in 2007. So she was like 2 at the time, and always like firstborn was the same as well. And we always have like young kids. So the stakes were sort of quite high. We always like these sort of like young families, and we landed this big partnership deal with a sort of like large accountancy practice that was going to be fairly transformative for us as a business. It was going to mean that we had this real route into the market, and it was going to really massively accelerate our growth. And it was a big deal. And so that was the point at which I said, right, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to go into doing FreeAgent first time. So I did that, and I told my boss, who I loved. My boss was great, and she knew I'd been working on FreeAgent. I said, right, this is going to be it. This is going to be a time when I'm going to start going into this sort of like full time. And she completely understood that and was like really supportive. And then things started going a bit quiet over in this like deal with this partnership, and to the point where, like, literally, I'm not even making this up. Like the sort of person who's in charge of that partnership was like, yeah, the check's in the post, and this was literally what they still use checks back then. The check was in the post. Needless to say, the check was not in the post. No check arrived, and that deal fell through. And so I'd quit my job. I had a young family, and it was not clear that the business was going to have enough money to support us. And I was like, well, what would I do? I'd go back to my boss and sort of like crawl back, and say, you can get my old job back, or do we just sort of like commit to this for the time being and then see if we can do something in other ways? And what we actually managed to do was to raise our first round of angel investment for Christoph Jans. So we managed to do that within a couple of months, and it was okay. That was really what we needed to sort of do that. So that came through, but that was definitely one of the things when I was like, oh my god, I've got like a baby to support, and I've quit my job, and there's no prospect of any money coming in. So
wow. Fantastic. What a great story. But it's also, one of the themes I see running through it as well is sort of a little bit about trusting your future self's going to sort out some of the difficult problems, right? That you are capable of dealing with a lot of these things as they come up, like difficult things like that you managed it, right? You pulled it out of the bag when you needed to, that you've got that capability to be able to solve future problems. Even if it's really hard at the time, that confidence you've got in yourself that actually future you can pull through.
Yeah, I think it's just about, if you've learned so much, in my private life as well as my professional life, like hobbies and things I do, I know that if I put my mind to something, I can learn it. And quite often that you look at something, you think, wow, that was really hard. But then you see, well, a bunch of other people do it, right? And if a bunch of other people can do it, then I can probably do it as well. I'm quite smart, I can probably do that. And so that's my first thought. I was like, I don't know how to do this thing other people do, so I can go and ask them, and they can help me. And I'll probably pick it up if I work hard and I'm at it. And so every problem that sort of like comes in, and I think I'm like, oh my god, what do I do here? That's where I can go back to. I was like, yeah, okay, you don't know how to do this, but you're probably going to be able to work it out if you work at it.
Wonderful. Well, hey, thank you very much for our conversation, Rowan. I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Great. No, that's been wonderful.
Where can people go and find out more from you or learn more about you?
To be honest, like, I'm pretty quiet on the socials these days. I used to be a little more active, and I'm not really now. But I am getting out there and talking at a lot more events these days, and doing things like this and podcasts and things like that. So it's probably just sort of like keeping an eye. I do have a Twitter account, which I never posted these days, Roan Lavery. But yeah, I think it's maybe just like, keep an eye on that, on my LinkedIn.
Well, I think your LinkedIn's pretty good, actually. If you don't mind people following you there's a lot of stuff you post up there in terms of your events. That's a good place to start. Yeah. And of course, FreeAgent, obviously, freeagent.com.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, check it out.
A little more on the product as well. Right. Thanks again for your time.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Bye.